Hello and welcome to the final day of this OECD event where we're looking at the consumer marketplace of the future. We've had people here from 100 different countries around the world, imagine, and 850 people following us at different points over the last 3 days. So it's been absolutely wonderful. So far, what have we looked at? We have looked at online marketplaces, we have looked at product safety, we've looked at attitudes to sustainable consumption. So today, we are moving on and we're talking about, a little bit later, we're talking about how to strengthen evidence, the evidence base for consumer policy making. Really important to know what works and what doesn't, whether the market is actually working in favour of the consumer or not. And it's actually quite difficult to get to that evidence. So we will talk about how we can do that. We're also having a session how to strengthen cross-border enforcement cooperation. So many of the sessions in the last 2 days have talked about this. We all know that national authorities cannot work alone anymore in this globalized, digitalized world. So it's so important that we find some way to cooperate on enforcement. So that's our panel later on. Now, today, first of all, we're starting off. We're looking in this panel how to get a better understanding of how consumers behave online, the complexities of online decision making. We're looking at commercial practices, dark patterns as they're known, which basically lead consumers into making decisions which might not be in their best interests. We all know that that's happening out there, so how to deal with it. It's going to be a really, really interesting session, I think. Remember, we do need your questions. We want your questions. We've had some really good questions in the last couple of days. So put them via the Q&A and you can vote them up, or so the favorite questions come to the top of the list and we will make sure that they are answered. Interpretation between French and English, please don't forget that's there. And Josh, our artist, is with us again. We've been loving the illustrations that we've been seeing. He's already hard at work. I'm sure that he was drawing consumer policy in his sleep last night because he's been just having to work at such a pace with all these ideas that have been coming out. So we will be looking at what Josh is doing as through the session and also at the end of the session. So let me introduce the panelists. First of all, Elisabeth Costa, who is Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships for Behavioural Insights team, basically informing and improving public service, behavioural insights in public services in over 30 countries, because I think you just started in the UK, but I mean, this has really grown, a very interesting area. Professor Amelia Fletcher, Professor of Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia, and she's going to tell us about a recent report on using disclosures for enhancing consumer engagement and competition. So welcome to you. Joining us from Tel Aviv, Dr. Dalia Shilian, Chief Economist for the Israel Consumer Protection and Fair Trade Authority. And you'll be giving us a bit of a sense of the role of behavioural insights for consumer policy decision-making in Israel. Very interesting. Alex Cohn is from IAB Technology Laboratory, which basically is an organization dealing with standards for digital advertising industry. And Alex will be talking about, amongst other things, I'm sure, how to simplify online disclosures for both consumers and businesses through standardization. We're delighted to have with us a special guest in this session, Orietta Maizza, who is in Rome. She's from the Italian G20 Digital Economy Task Force, and will be reporting on a recent G20 multi-stakeholder forum on consumer protection. And that actually featured a session on online disclosures. So obviously hugely relevant to this session. The person who is going to be leading you and all of us through this session is Stacy Feuer. We met earlier in the week. Stacy, great to see you. Stacy is the Assistant Director for International Consumer Protection for the US Federal Trade Commission. Stacy, over to you.
Many thanks, Katie. Good to see you again, and thank you for these great introductions. So today's topic is online disclosures, and really this is something that is at the heart of consumer policy. Disclosures are really everywhere, and they have been for a long time in consumer contracts, privacy notices, product safety recalls, class action notices, you name it. But it's only now that we're getting a better sense of how consumers actually interact with these online disclosures. I know that my agency, the US Federal Trade Commission, put out a publication more than 20 years ago called .com disclosures at the beginning of the internet age. But here we are 20, 30 years on, and we're getting new insights from behavioral studies and experiments about the degree to which consumers do or don't understand disclosures. We're seeing the need for more evidence-based information and discussion about the effects of online disclosures and about things like dark commercial patterns, which may manipulate or distort consumer choice. So there's a lot to speak about here this morning, and I'm really looking forward to hearing this panel. But before we get into the panelists themselves, as Katie said, we have the pleasure of hearing from Orietta, who is with Italy's G20 task force on the digital economy. So Orietta, if you can start out by telling us a little bit about your recent meetings and the kinds of conclusions and information that you have about this topic of online disclosures, that would be a great way to start us off.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to participate in this conference, and I'm pleased to give you a brief overview of the work in progress that the Italian G20 presidency is doing in the field of consumer protection in the track of the digital economy. In particular, on the 6th of May was held in a virtual format, of course, a multi-stakeholder forum on consumers' awareness, protection, and blockchain for traceability in the digital economy. Speakers and panelists represented most of the G20 governments and attendee as well, many other public institutions, the European Commission, OECD, and UNCTAD, which gave us also an important support in organizing it, and other international organizations participated together with G20 engagement groups and other stakeholders. The forum represented a very interesting opportunity to exchange views and cooperate. In fact, as Katie was saying, considering that digital markets nowadays allow consumers to have access to an increasingly wide and varied range of goods and services, and to interact with different kinds of sellers and providers, it can derive a greater probability of incurring into unreliable counterparties, counterfeit or unsafe products, theft of personal data, and other situations less susceptible to controls and hinder the intervention of a single country, thus calling for a strengthened cooperation. The COVID pandemic, as we know, boosted the diffusion of digital transactions, but also the risks, adding new examples of bad practices. Hence, current and future challenges require consumers to be very well equipped with a wide range of skills and information. And moreover, they must be informed consumers in order to be more conscious when they make choices that can contribute shaping digital and more sustainable economic development. So during the forum, 3 thematic parallel sessions were focused on deepening specific issues as consumers' awareness and education, blockchain for traceability of consumer goods, and online disclosures. Just a very brief overview of the main points highlighted in the first 2 sessions before passing to today's core subject. Under consumers' awareness and education, there was a wide consensus that these aspects are a key prerequisite in order to develop trust towards digital markets and empower consumers. Public-related campaigns proved to be a real test case in order to alert and protect consumers. The second session was focused on traceability of consumer goods and how we can benefit of distributed leverage technologies such as blockchain. There is still much to do under this chapter, not only from a technological point of view, but an increasing number of public agencies are piloting supply chain applications for traceability of consumer goods with a strong focus on trademarks and anti-counterfeiting and ensuring quality and origin and international cooperation could spread culture and improve knowledge about these new technologies and more other things. Finally, but not least, last but not least, the session on online disclosures. Effective, well-targeted information can assist consumer decision-making by facilitating the comparison of products, increasing transparency and accountability, reducing search costs, helping to prevent disputes and protecting consumers from deceptive practices, thus promoting trust and empowering consumers. Indeed, online disclosure are a key enabler of informed purchasing decisions taken online, but they actually achieve the result only if they are actually noticed, taken into account, which means read, seen, and understood. And these steps are basically what is behind the effectiveness of the disclosures that have been investigated with respect to behavioral biases of consumers. In order to test and enhance the effectiveness of online disclosures, governments have fostered behavioral experiments, surveys, interviews, and mystery shopping, but also guidance to businesses. It is important to use behavioral insights to deepen understanding of consumer behavior and biases online, and how these biases may affect consumer reactions to online disclosures and prey in particular on consumer vulnerability. And this was discussed and confronted in several fields: product safety, price comparison, and data protection in particular. Directly involving businesses and providing guidance to them is an important leverage to incentive businesses in providing full and correct information, to prevent the use of dark patterns that prey on consumer biases, and to lead consumers to make decisions in their best interests. As there appears to be a trade-off between the requirement to provide full and complete information to consumers and clear, plain language, concise and easily accessible, new communication approaches could be explored based on icons. Our data protection authority is experiencing this, symbols or developing trust marks that could support SMEs' competitiveness as well. Eventually, and so I conclude, a virtuous way to achieve a real protection of consumers passes through the cooperation between not only governments, but between authorities, businesses, consumers, and other stakeholders to create an ecosystem of education first and trust to the digital economy. I thank you all, and sorry for taking some seconds more than I'm allowed to, and I pass the floor back to Stacy.
Thank you very much, Orietta. And it was great to hear that the Italian G20 presidency has put this topic on the agenda and recognized the importance of experiments and education in this area. And I think that provides us with a terrific departure point for me to turn to Elisabeth. Elisabeth, you are an expert in behavioral insights, and I'm hoping you can give us a real sense of how your company works to improve disclosures and what kind of work have you done to import behavioral insights into very practical consumer-facing applications. So I turn it over to you to kick off by explaining to us this entire field of behavioral insights.
Fantastic, thanks, Stacy. It's just a small question to start us off. Look, it's a pleasure to be here today, and it's great to hear about what's happening at the G20 as well. So thank you, Orietta, for that introduction. I want to start by taking a slight step back and to talk about how behavioural insights have been applied to consumer markets more generally. And I think the traditional regulatory approach has been underpinned by a fairly classical economic approach and a belief that consumers act in an economically rational way, and that in particular that we're very sensitive to price signals. And I should start by saying that I spent the first 7 years of my career at the Australian Treasury working on economic policy. I have a very deep belief in the power and efficacy of markets, which I'm sure many of the participants here do as well. But I think what's been consistently underweighted is the subtle behavioural market failures that are present across consumer markets, and particularly the disproportionate impact of small frictional factors, which don't tend to be a feature of economic models, but in reality tend to deter us from making decisions within markets that are in our best interests. And what all of this means is that consumers often don't behave in the way that an economics textbook might expect or predict. And the way that these behavioural biases and barriers manifest are quite wide-ranging. So they range from things like choice overload and information overload, particularly when it comes to online disclosures, that mean that people tend to be paralysed, they tend to stick with the default, or potentially make decisions that are not in line with their best interests. And they move from those very well evidenced biases through to the more subtle behavioural effects of things like scarcity. So where people are burdened with many worries in their lives, particularly money worries, they tend to tunnel and make very short-term decisions. And all of these factors together, these behavioural market failures, go a long way to explain why across regulated consumer markets, both offline and online, you see impacts and outcomes that you wouldn't predict with a classical economic model. So why people are overpaying for broadband contracts, why people are not switching providers in energy markets and other markets. And our focus today, why people tend to make quick and flawed decisions online that may not be aligned with their best interests. So in particular, things like agreeing to share very granular personal data, getting stuck in online subscription traps, or we have a project underway with the French fraud authorities at the moment to test new ways to improve consumer protection against online fraud. And at BIT, we've worked across many different markets and around the world on these issues. And I'm looking forward to highlighting some of those examples today, but I think if I could distill the core themes of those trials and those interventions, it's that we can go a long way to simplify the choices that people are making online, improve the information and disclosures that consumers are receiving, remove friction in processes to get the best outcomes for consumers, and also particularly focus on timely interventions. So giving consumers the information they need at the point at which they're making a choice or decision. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to highlighting some of those through the discussion.
Thanks. And thanks for ending with that note about just-in-time disclosures, which I think is a really interesting issue. So I'll turn now to Dalia, who is the chief economist for the Israeli Consumer Protection Authority, and ask her for the agency view. Dalia, what are you doing at your agency about behavioral insights, and how has the Israeli agency's approach to behavioral insights changed over time? I know, again, at my agency, we have many economists. You're the chief economist at the Israeli agency. And so we'll be very interested in hearing sort of how this new area of economics plays out in an actual agency setting. So over to you, Dalia.
Thank you, Stacy. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So over the past few years, several government offices in Israel have tried to use behavioral insights in order to improve several issues. For example, by embedding behavioral insight through nudges in order to design a letter or notice that will encourage people to pay their bills. We at the authority try to rely on empirical data about consumers' behavior because there is a big discrepancy between actual consumers' behavior and the way policymakers and legal experts, such as judges and lawyers, assume consumer would act. So, for example, there was a class action in Israel against a specific company when important information was not displayed to consumer at the purchase stage, but rather it was displayed in the terms and conditions, and this caused many consumers to miss important information. So the company offered a settlement saying that it will highlight the fact that this important information will be in the terms and conditions, and the judge thought that this was good enough. We, of course, objected to this settlement, and we brought empirical data in order to explain the court that it should take into consideration the fact that most consumers do not read those terms and conditions, so it's not a good settlement. So back to you, Stacy. Thank you.
Great. Had a little trouble with the unmute button for just a second there. So that's very interesting to hear. And that provides a great segue to our next focus of our discussion, which is really drilling down into online disclosures. So as we've already said, disclosures are everywhere in terms and conditions and privacy notices. You mentioned product recalls, advertising, and this is an area where consumer protection agencies have benefited enormously from the insights of behavioral sciences research. There have been several agencies that have done their own experiments, and the OECD, our Committee on Consumer Policy, has also recently released the results of a small lab experiment on personalized pricing and disclosures. So I want to turn now back to Elisabeth to highlight the results of some of these experiments that you've worked on extensively. How successful are online disclosures in actually enabling informed consumer choice? And what are the key barriers to online disclosure effectiveness in your experience?
Thanks, Stacy. Look, I think the simple answer and one of the major barriers is that these disclosures tend to be long and technical and confusing. And I'm a lawyer by training, and I have read many of these disclosures as part of my work. And I confess myself to being confused at points by them. And particularly online, the Wall Street Journal did a piece recently where they looked at how long it took to read the online terms and conditions of key consumer platforms. And most of them take up to 40 minutes to read. And that's just not something that consumers have time for or interest in their day-to-day lives. And so I think one of the fundamental issues is that disclosures are designed to manage the risk of businesses, not to aid consumer understanding. And, I think that risk management piece is a really important element of well-functioning markets and is not one to be discounted. But we need to find a way to rebalance this so that, that is done alongside a consumer-facing view around comprehension and engagement. And I think I'd like to illustrate this with a specific example, which is actually an offline example, but I think illustrates the core behavioural principles. So in the UK, we ran a large randomised control trial on pensions guidance. And in this country, when people are approaching retirement, they're given information about that decision and pointed to guidance. And despite that guidance being free and well regarded, the take-up's very low. And the way that people are pointed towards this is generally with a document pack of around 150 pages of everything they could possibly want or need to know about their pension choices. And unsurprisingly, the engagement with that is really quite low. So what we did is we tested the impact of radically simplifying that information to a one-page disclosure. which gave people all the information that they needed to access guidance. It overcame behavioural barriers of information and choice overload, present bias, scarcity. And what we saw was a 10-fold increase in the number of people accessing that guidance. So I think what to take away from that is that it is possible to radically improve comprehension and engagement with disclosures, online or offline. But it is important to say that in these trials, and I'll highlight some we've done online in the next section, we're often coming off a very low base of comprehension and engagement. So it is possible to have low cost, dramatic improvements, but these underlying decisions remain complex. And, I do think we need to move beyond disclosure to think about what other interventions we can design to improve consumer understanding.
Great. So yeah. Thank you. So this, you're mentioning the 150 pages of documents for pensions brings me to Amelia. Amelia, in your recent report on using disclosures as a tool for enhancing consumer engagement, you also highlighted that merely providing consumers with information may not be enough. And in this context, you refer to literature highlighting not only risk overload, but also the possible risk of even having anti-competitive effects in disclosure policy. So I'll turn it over to you to ask you, to what extent do governments, as we think about disclosure policy and the OECD, what extent do we need to think about these business incentives when thinking about designing disclosures, and even whether or not to mandate specific types of disclosures or the provision of information that contains certain specific points? So over to you, Amelia.
Thanks, and thanks to the OECD for inviting me. I mean, clearly, as Liz has highlighted very clearly, disclosure can be done better or worse. So, and clearly a big issue with disclosures is that they're simply ignored if they're too complicated, and that can be true even if they are kind of clear and prominent. That's been shown in plenty of randomized controlled trials. It is true that you can improve it, but it's interesting if you think about the firm's incentives, because actually, if you disclose in a way that worsens consumer decision making, either through providing too much information and thus just befuddling consumers, or by providing information in a misleading way and otherwise exploiting consumer behavioral biases, then that can actually be good for the firm, because either directly because consumers are persuaded to buy a product that they might not otherwise have bought, or not to search around, or so to buy a product with a higher markup than they would otherwise have paid, but also indirectly and more worryingly, because if consumers aren't making good decisions on the demand side, actually you're not going to get competition working very well on the supply side. Competition will be dampened, competition will be distorted, and that will be not a good outcome. And that means in turn that firms don't really necessarily, unfortunately, always have consumers' interests at heart when they're engaging in disclosure, and they may have an incentive to engage in ineffective, detrimental disclosure. So in terms of policy recommendations, I do think that where we are imposing proactive disclosure requirements, that's often necessary, but it might not be sufficient. And it is really important to be doing the sorts of testing that Liz was describing. But I do think we also need to be moving more onto thinking about where disclosures are provided, that they are not false or misleading. So this is even the voluntary disclosures that are made by firms, and thinking much more about the choice architecture, so the way in which the information is presented to consumers, and not just what the information is. So the framework, the interface that is provided to consumers, recognizing that even true information can be misleading, because consumers can be misled by, for example, default they have default bias, so they might stick with pre-ticked boxes. They may have saliency bias, so they stick at the top of a ranking. Even if all the information is in front of them, they may make bad decisions if it's presented in particular ways. I think the other thing that I brought out in my paper was I think we need to think very hard about how we can develop ways of facilitating consumer search and choice. So, for example, can authorities do more to enable the development and functioning of helpful tools like recommender systems and digital comparison tools? So that may involve requirements about access to data or about how comparison results are presented. And I think that's where you can really start to help consumers, because they can really value that advice. So if you can get the advice to work, then that's great. One final point is that in terms of the incredibly important experiments like Liz does, obviously the firms may not have the right incentives to engage in them. And I know that has been an issue sometimes. So they don't want to necessarily test the disclosure option that they suspect is going to be the most effective. So in the UK, actually, in some of the regulated sectors, there's increasingly requirements being put on firms to engage with these sorts of randomized controlled trials, so that it becomes less of a negotiation about which things we're going to test, and the regulator can say, no, these are the things we're going to test.
That's very interesting. And now that you've put the issue of business incentives right top of mind, I want to turn to Alex and ask him, what would you say the main challenges and possible costs relating to online disclosures are for businesses? What do you think about regulatory requirements to test certain types of disclosures? How burdensome is it for firms to implement disclosure requirements? And how do online businesses deal with requirements that differ across jurisdictions? So that's a lot for you, Alex,
yeah.
But very interested to hear your thoughts.
I'll work backwards, actually, because I think the real challenges are in that last piece, is that the differing requirements as you move from region to region and sort of topic area to topic area. Obviously, privacy disclosures are going to be different than product recall disclosures, of course. But if you think about within a topic area like privacy or whatever, that's where my case study really is in terms of my experience in seeing the direct effect of sort of the cost burden. But yeah, if you think about, I need to, as a business, figure out how to meet requirements and comply with policies in the European Union, but also in different member states of the European Union, in California and Virginia in the US. And as you start looking at that, even in just one issue area of disclosures, you've got sort of a mess of something to maintain if you're thinking about, even if you build to all of those with your systems and your like online systems, you're now needing to keep up with how each of those move. So I think it's really, the challenge is fragmentation. And what we're trying to do from the standard side, now I come at it in a specific kind of area of disclosures in digital advertising, but what we're trying to do there is give companies frameworks to actually be able to adapt in a more seamless way to changing regulations, so that they're not necessarily having to follow each and every single one individually and build separate frameworks for each of those. So it's definitely like that last bit of differing requirements is the main challenge, I would say.
It's very helpful to hear that viewpoint, and also to hear about standardization, which is one thing that has been proposed as a solution to making more effective disclosures. And that's where we're turning now, to how to make disclosures more effective. And I want to go back to Dalia and ask her about the recent laboratory study that she published of native advertising disclosures. So Dalia, could you briefly explain your findings and illustrate how they can be used to improve online disclosures for consumers?
Yes, so in many Israeli websites, like many other websites all over the world, marketers publish advertisements that look exactly like article, and they use all kinds of disclosures which their efficiency is not clear. Do those disclosures actually reflect consumer the fact that he is reading an advertisement? So we gather the most frequent and commonly disclosure in Israeli website, and we conducted 2 experiments. I did it with my colleague, Professor Feuer. In the first experiment, we collected 1,600 participants in a nationally representative sample in Israel, and all participants read the exact same 3 advertisement, which looks like article, but the difference was that in each condition, participants were exposed to a different kind of disclosure. And we also had a control group with no disclosure, and it was our benchmark. And our findings indicated that those disclosures that contained the company's names, for example, sponsored by, let's say, OECD Furnitures, they significantly improved recognition rate. But however, those disclosures that didn't contain the company's name, for example, sponsored content and nothing else, did not have any impact on consumers' recognition rate. So in experiment 2, we want to further explore the possible effect of the company's name, and we added the company's name to those disclosures that in experiment 1 had no effect at all, and still we got the same result, according to which adding the company's name significantly improved recognition rate. The highest, we had one disclosure that yielded the highest recognition rate, and it was advertisement plus the company's name. However, even in that case, the maximum recognition rate was only 50%, which is quite low. So we are going in Israel. So what we would like to do is to change the regulation by having just one terms, advertising plus company's name. So all marketers have to use this term instead of many disclosure that actually confuse consumers. And last thing that I want to say is that we believe that the effect of the company's name may stem from 2 reasons. So the first one is the obvious, it reveals the commercial relationship. But the second is that the company's name may serve as a dynamic disclosure because the company's name is constantly changing. We think that it actually prevents the normal habitation process where it occurs when consumer face repetitive stimuli.
So that's very interesting. And let me turn now very briefly to you, Liz. You've done a lot of experiments, and one of the areas where I know you've done experience, or 2 of the areas, are terms and conditions and privacy. If you could just give us the top line recommendation from those areas on how to improve disclosures, and particularly how to improve disclosures for non-homogeneous consumers or for heterogeneous consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. So we ran a series of lab experiments with UK business and UK.
No, let me skip you now. I'm very sorry, Liz, your sound isn't working. Let's go to Amelia. Just pivot for a moment. Beyond improved requirements or recommendations regarding disclosure design, what complementary measures can government authorities take to enhance consumer awareness and understanding of disclosures?
So, I mean, I think that online in a particular issue is that consumers can't assess quality very easily. I mean, that's always an issue, but online you just can't see the thing and you can't talk to the salesperson. So any tools that help them to assess quality can be really valuable for consumers. And that means things like consumer reviews and ratings, recommender systems like rankings or buy boxes, and also things like social media influencers really kind of go up the scale of what we should care about as consumer bodies. But of course, we know that in turn, lots of new issues are arising. So things like selectivity in the use of ratings and reviews, criteria being used in recommender systems that may not be in consumers' interest, blurring of lines between paid for and organic content, so advertising and non-advertising, and even outright fraudulent activities like fake reviews. So I think, first of all, we just need to make sure that all of these things are properly covered by consumer law. And it isn't always obviously the case. Sometimes the consumer law is about things being untrue rather than misleading, misdirectional. I also think there really needs to be thought given to giving appropriate responsibility to platforms to ensure proactively that they are not facilitating these harmful practices, even if they're not intentionally being harmful themselves. And all of this needs to be properly enforced. And this is really hard with these big global players to enforce against.
I'm glad that you raised the issue of enforcement, particularly against large global tech companies. That's something that we'll be turning to later today. Now I want to turn back to Alex on this question. How can we make disclosures more effective? I know you've worked on simplifying disclosures for consumers and businesses through standardization. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
And I'll try to be quick, knowing that we need to catch up on time. So really, Tech Lab, standards exist for simplification, really, fundamentally. And again, our real use case here has been privacy as it relates to digital advertising. And what we've been doing there is, if you think about part of the issues that create privacy questions in digital advertising, it's a large supply chain, right? That is processing data. So what we've actually worked on is, how do we do two things? One, standardize how we talk about data uses in consumers and the controls that we can give them around that. And then two, once you have that, making it so it's possible to send signals digitally through the supply chain in actual real time, talking about just in time kind of disclosure, but sending signals through the supply chain in real time that share with different suppliers in that supply chain what transparency has been shown to a user, what data uses have been shown, and what any choices that user might have made. Obviously, every time you load up a page, you're not necessarily making choices about what data uses or you're sort of allowing, but those things can also be saved and sent through the supply chain on every time an app or page loads on the internet. So we've been focused on how we can, get the actual data uses with relationship to privacy standardized and then broadcast them through the supply chain. And that hopefully can help not only in consumers, but businesses as they wade through, a lot of different sort of policies around different disclosures.
Great, thank you. So let's turn now and shift focus to the area of dark commercial patterns, which is very closely related. So these are dark commercial patterns are online choice architectures that may lead consumers into making decisions that they may not have made themselves, or that might not be in their best interests. And a number of consumer protection authorities around the world are considering dark patterns right now, as well as the OECD. The Committee on Consumer Policy has an ongoing project on the topic. So hopefully Elisabeth has her sound back, and I want to turn to you And I know you authored a report on behavioral insights and online harms, where you highlight the potential for firms to exploit consumer biases online, which is at the heart of dark commercial patterns. Can you provide us some examples of dark commercial patterns and how they exploit consumer biases? And just getting back to the last question, particularly with respect to vulnerable consumers.
Absolutely, and sorry to my sound earlier. I just want to give you the two headline results about experimental online disclosures. So,
I'm sorry, Elisabeth, your sound is still not working. Yeah, let me turn perhaps to Dalia, and if you can fix it, we'll turn back to you. So Dalia, what for you are the key challenges with this area, dark patterns, for consumer protection enforcement authorities?
So first, the field of dark patterns lacks of clear and comprehensive definition for what constitutes a dark pattern and what might be considered as a legitimate marketing tactics. So first, we need to have a clear definition. Second, we have to distinguish, it's important to distinguish dark patterns from other practices. For example, several hotel booking sites use urgency queues. For example, there is only one room left, that many consider as a dark pattern. However, if it's, for example, the high season and I would like to book a hotel, so wouldn't it a useful piece of information to know that there is only one room left? The problem is that if it is false information, but then we are simply talking about deception, which at least in Israel and I guess in many other countries as well, is already prohibited. So in my opinion, it's very important to make those differentiation. Otherwise, everything might be considered as dark patterns, and I don't think that it will contribute to our effort to handle this phenomenon.
Very interesting. Well, let me turn back to Alex and ask you whether there is any concern in the business community about this issue of dark patterns and online choice architecture.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. And I've sat in sort of standards policy discussions where, you know, actually a lot of time has been put into how can we even, as we're thinking about technical standards to respond to like regional and regulatory policies that actually really meet the spirit of what the concern is here. I think it's really hard, and it gets back to the point that was made right before. You know, once you start talking about design, there's a lot of opinions when it comes to design, right? So I think it's one of those very interesting things that anything might be called a dark pattern, and especially for industries that might be seen to have an incentive to create sort of leading choices. There might be a bias even to assume that any sort of disclosure model that they're using is probably going to be a dark pattern, because surely that industry wouldn't want to do the right thing. So, I think the business community does care. I think the other reason the business community cares is because if you are a business that wants to avoid regulatory sort of fines, then you're going to care about the quality of the disclosure that's made, because if find yourself in a regulatory dispute and you're having to point to something that wasn't a strong disclosure as your sort of defense, it stands to reason that a business would want to know that the disclosures that were made were strong and defensible before entering into some sort of business practice as maybe a supplier to an online site like technology that's supporting like ads in the ecosystem that I work in.
That's interesting. And so there are these incentives for business. Turning from the definitional issues, which I think are important here, as Dalia highlighted, I want to turn to the detriment issues. So Amelia, recognizing that perhaps not every online design is in fact a dark pattern, when there are dark patterns, what are the consumer detriments that arise from them? Amelia, you're yeah.
Clearly, the main issues are that they can lead to poor consumer decision making, as I discussed before, so that consumers may end up buying the wrong things, and that can also harm competition. That said, I do think it's hard to draw the line between dark patterns and just marketing. But I would actually not, I think, agree with Dalia's view. I don't think that whether something is false is the only factor that affects whether it is leading to poor consumer behavior. So I think dark patterns can, affect consumer behavior in at least a couple of different ways. One is they provide this choice architecture that leads consumers in particular ways. So it could be pre-ticked boxes, it could be bright green buttons, it could be anything. And the second is actually that they can just be given messages that lead them to have to make decisions too quickly. And we know that basically consumers can think in different ways depending on essentially how much time they put into their thinking. And if they're rushed, they will make worse decisions. So I think some of the things like provide websites that give a false sense of scarcity about a product or a false sense of urgency, that can lead to consumers making overly rushed decisions and missing, key aspects of the product. And I don't think that a false sense of urgency means that the facts actually have to be false, but they can be presented, true facts can be presented in a way that nonetheless generates a false sense of urgency or scarcity. So I do think the line is hard, but I do think that falseness is not the only thing we can rely on. Clearly, I think in the end, people like Liz are going to be really important, because the thing we really need to understand is collect more and more information on exactly how different patterns affect consumer behavior in either positive or negative ways.
So that's a good segue to Liz, who hopefully has her sound back now.
Can you hear me, Stacy?
Yes, I can.
Oh, wonderful.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Sorry about that. Look, I think, and thanks, Amelia, for that as well. I mean, it's been fantastic hearing what the other panelists are saying, and particularly the highly empirical approach that's being taken in Israel and the US and around the world to these issues. I just want to wrap up by talking very briefly about what distinguishes online disclosures from offline. And, I think that in my mind, online environments are highly curated and deliberate in their design. And what that means is that businesses and platforms are able to collect very granular and detailed information about the choices and decisions that people make off the back of disclosures. And compared to an offline disclosure where we're sending a letter, we're not really sure whether people are reading that, what choices they're making off the back of it. Online, what we're doing is giving clues and cues to businesses, which, if there's not aligned incentives, I think open the door to manipulation and exploitation of behavioural biases. So I just want to wrap up on that and say thank you, and I've really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you very much. And I'm so glad that we are getting to hear you again because you have a lot to say. So let's go to the Q&A now. And we do have some very interesting questions. One from our UK colleague who asks, for especially complex decisions, for example, about data sharing or long-term risk management, disclosure may not be the answer, but what is? Do policymakers simply need to prohibit certain practices outright, for example, dark patterns, or if we can agree what they are, or price discrimination based on protected characteristics? Or are there solutions like outcome regulation, independent disclosure auditing, or explicit duties on firms? Are these worth further thought? I see a lot of you shaking your heads. I'll start with Amelia.
So I think they certainly are worth they certainly are worth further thought. I think that, for example, in the area of privacy and data sharing, at the moment, people have no idea, and they've got click happy because we get these things where we have to click all the time to see a website. And so it's almost leading to people not engaging at all, where the intention was to try and get engagement. We could, for example, I think, do better in that space if we had certain minimum standards that every site had to abide by, so that if we got something popping up, it would mean this is different. Actually think about it, have a look. We would also do better, I think, if we did have some simplified codes for what different privacy levels were. So we could say, okay, this is privacy level 1 or 2 or 3, and it means this, and we get used to what that means. And I think we could then think, okay, for this site, I'm willing to go to that privacy level. For this site, I'm not. But it would make us the whole thing a whole lot easier. In terms of outcome regulation, yes, I think firms are in a much better position to see whether they've achieved an outcome. And it's really, really hard for regulators to say, do it exactly this way. It's going to be much better to say, show us that you've achieved it.
Great. And let me ask Dalia as well, since I saw her nodding her head vigorously.
I agree. Disclosure is not the answer for everything. For example, in the case of native advertising, I showed before that even our best disclosure only held 50% recognition rate, which is quite low. Half of the people, they didn't realize that what they are watching was actually an advertisement. So, for example, in this case, because those articles looks exactly like the editorial content. So in that case, for example, we have to use more means, such as visual means. So disclosure is not the answer for everything. We should take it with other means as well. Depends on the situation. I agree.
Great. And I also saw Alex nodding his head.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of focused on privacy and advertising in these answers, and that's where I can speak to and where I was nodding my head. I think defaults or baselines of data protection, which I actually think is what there was obviously unintended consequences of information overload from a regulation like the GDPR, but like the fact that it is focused on, like, let's just protect data at a baseline so that there can be a common understanding that certain things aren't going to happen, right? So that I don't, if I know that I'm in this, in this regulatory space, at least I know as a consumer that certain things just won't happen, and that doesn't have to be disclosed to me. So yeah, I agree with the other panelists that it is disclosures and forcing a lot of consumer controls and choice on people all the time, especially when they're complex. It's just, it's not always the answer. And in fact, it's probably a lot of times not the answer.
Thank you. And I will give Elisabeth the final minute of Q&A response for her view on this.
Well, I think just to pick up on Amelia's point about outcome regulation and how regulators can approach that. We've talked a lot today about the experiments that have been run by BIT and by regulators around the world on online disclosures and comprehension and engagement in those. And I think a practical thing that regulators can do is to set a benchmark of actually what is the expectation of the baseline level of understanding of online disclosures and engagement with them. And then run those experiments on an ongoing basis to see whether firms are meeting those benchmarks. And ideally, you'd have a mechanism over the top of that to not just incentivize firms to get to the threshold, but actually to exceed that and to go beyond that for consumer outcomes.
Thanks very much. So we've now reached the end of our session. And unfortunately, we have to stop this conversation, which I think I could engage in all day. So I want to thank you for such a fascinating discussion. I see that we already have some great drawings up from Josh from Live Illustration. He has been illustrating throughout the conference. And you know, I feel like I don't even have to wrap up because Josh is so succinctly raising issues about choice architecture and the line between design and dark commercial patterns, between what's false, what's misleading. So there's a lot there in the drawings, and I encourage everybody to take a look at them. So in the 1 minute I have left, clearly online disclosures is an important area, regardless of what tools we ultimately use. There still will be disclosures, so we have to think about getting it right, but we have to recognize that disclosures may not always be the best and most effective consumer policy. We have to recognize that consumers have these behavioral biases that Elisabeth talked about. We have to also, as consumer protection authorities, do the research. So not only people like Liz, but people like Dalia in Israel and her authority doing research to better understand how consumers interact with and understand disclosures, and most importantly, how they affect their behavior. So there are limits, there are challenges, there are barriers, there are questions of business incentives. There's a lot here for us to dig down into as our committee, the Committee on Consumer Policy, looks to its agenda ahead. And we look forward to getting your expertise and input as we drill down in the future into these questions. Thank you so much, everyone.